G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy. Today I thought I would change things up a little bit, go back to a standard me versus the camera style video and actually take a trip down memory lane and look at my predictions that I made in March at the start of the year for how I thought 2025 was going to play out. And we're going to look at what those predictions were and react to them and see how good or bad I did at this particular job. I remember I took a bit of time away from footy at the start of this year. I was in Perth, had just moved back to Australia, so had really disconnected from the sport and the league, and then rolled straight into my ladder prediction after that. So I remember thinking, these are not going to be taken well, and I'm a little bit nervous to see how I actually did in the ladder prediction and how badly it's going to be. But these videos are always fun, so I am sort of nervous but kind of a little excited to see how I thought the season was going to play out 6 or 7 months ago. Before we get into it, if you do me a favor, if you are one of the 95,000 people that have watched a True Footy video in the last 28 days, it would really mean a lot to me if you considered subscribing. Roughly only about 1/3 of that percentage of people has actually hit subscribe. So if you are enjoying the content, it would mean a lot if you help me grow this footy channel. But for the time being, let's get into my ladder prediction. I remember I did it 18th to 1st, and I spoke about teams in groups. So how we're going to do this is we're going to start with the bottom 3 teams, the prediction of how I thought it was going to go, and then I will react to it, I guess. I'm going to say North Melbourne, then West Coast, then Richmond make up the bottom 3 with the Tigers going back-to-back in wooden spoons. Honestly, I just can't really make a case for Richmond finishing anywhere else. There are a few things in football I'm confident about where a team is going to finish, but I just think the odds are so stacked against Richmond to move up the ladder in a meaningful way, and I think it's very easy to make the case that they're behind clubs like West Coast and North Melbourne who have been, slowly improving over the last few years. Interestingly, Richmond were the 4th oldest team this time last year. Obviously had a diabolical run with injury. They're now the 3rd youngest because they've lost Baker, Bolton, Rioli, Jack Graham, and Dustin Martin, amongst others, retired as well. So I think that one is the easiest case to be made. Separating North Melbourne and West Coast is tough. You could go into the argument about North Melbourne having, accumulated a little bit more talent. I'm not convinced that will necessarily translate in more wins. What will dictate who finishes higher is who is better in more games this year. And last year, both teams were great for about 4 or 5 games of the season and pretty poor for a lot of the rest of it. I would argue North Melbourne probably looked better for longer. It just ended up that West Coast ended up winning more games. They played each other twice and split it 1-1. I just think it might go the other way this year. I think North Melbourne probably have a little bit more reason to improve. I think West Coast is still going to be a work in progress. New coach, adapting to a game style. Similar year to last year. North Melbourne will probably just pip them, but I honestly think it could go either way. Okay, so not a great start. Yes, I got the 3 teams correct, just in wrong order, or at least 2 of them in the wrong order. That doesn't seem so bad on the surface level. However, we kind of all knew that there were going to be these bottom 3 teams, or at least in my opinion. So the fact that I got them in the wrong order doesn't, it's not a great prediction, especially when you consider how badly I underrated Richmond. I think it was quite clear to see pretty early in the season that they had the superior senior players. That's definitely something I acknowledged fairly quickly and felt silly about ignoring. West Coast comparatively did not have as many quality established players, and the ones that they did have got injured, and the list is just not as equipped as Richmond's to be competitive in season 2025. I'd say Richmond had a pretty successful season. West Coast did not, that's for sure. 1 win. I would say that's a pretty bad prediction, but I did have North higher than both clubs, and that ended up being correct. I got North actually bang on this exact position. I think overall they definitely improved. They probably showed it in flashes. I mean, they had good wins over Carlton and a big win over Melbourne. That probably was a stride in itself, and they beat Richmond twice and they beat West Coast. So I'd say clear improvement there, and that's about as what I expected from North. I did hope West Coast would be a little bit closer to them, but I was wrong. Let's have a look at how I saw the next 3 teams going down. So picking the other team who's going to finish 4th last in the bottom 4. Last year it was Adelaide, and it took a pretty bad run with the Crows, massively falling short of expectations last year. It's going to take something like that again this year for a team to finish in the bottom 4. So which team is the most likely to do that is an impossible task. However, I'm going to go with Melbourne here. Maybe that's a little bit of a cop-out. It's tough because Melbourne still have one of the best cores of talent, particularly in that midfield with Gawn, Petrarca, and Oliver. who may or may not be back to some of his best footy. We don't know. That'll be a big question mark for them. But there's been a big push towards youth over the last few years. And I suppose it's almost a case of Melbourne having the most potential for the wheels to fall off, because we've seen that happen to them in recent times. So I don't feel good about it. They could have easily finished 7th or 8th, in my opinion, but I'm going to say Melbourne is the most likely to have a disastrous season out of all of these teams. In 14th, I'm going Essendon, and 13th, I'm going St Kilda, and I really don't feel good about that. I think I would have had St Kilda in my 8th prior to the off-season, but that just speaks to the even nature of this competition. And we'll start with Essendon. I just have so little trust with them, and it will be a big question for them this year, getting some ROI on some of the kids they've drafted over the last 4 years. You know, obviously they had that big draft in 2020. They got Perkins, Reid, and Cox. Since then, they've got Ben Hobbs, Elijah Sardis. They've drafted Kako, who looks fantastic. Obviously, I did watch that preseason game against the Cats. Nate Caddy, I'm a huge fan of and have been talking up since he was drafted by them. So there is some good quality youth on that list. They were sitting in the top 4 in round 18 of last year, and then the season completely collapsed. So again, it probably comes down to this belief that Essendon could capitulate at any point, which is why I'm a little bit biased against them somewhat when concocting a ladder prediction. And now let's move to St Kilda, who it's probably similar with. Now, St Kilda finished the year really strongly last year. They certainly pants my boys West Coast, and they played really well, and beat Geelong late in the year. It was a genuinely good run of form. And I'm optimistic that St Kilda could play finals. I really do think some of the talent that they've drafted in recent years is really strong. I suppose it'll be interesting to see to what extent their push towards the youth dominates their selection and their strategy this year. I think one thing that makes them vulnerable a little bit is their midfield. You've got Jack Steele, you've got Jack McRae in there, who wasn't really working out at the Bulldogs, obviously pushed around the field, and tried to go for Merritt and Callahan, missed out. And with someone like a Philippou missing, I think, the early part of the season, I guess I'm a little bit unsure how that midfield rolls out for 2025. On the other hand, they are an extremely good defensive side. Their back six is really strong, and they're really strong. If I'm not mistaken, they were equal first with Geelong last year for defensive transition, so scoring from the back half. So can they get away with that again this year with a midfield that on paper doesn't really hold the same punch as other teams vying for the 8, and Max King also has an injury as well. So that all being said, I just can't trust St Kilda, but I do like them. I like their young talent. Maybe it's just a little bit early. Maybe in a couple of years, St Kilda will start to enter their window. Okay, so I had Melbourne in 15th, and they were one off that. They finished one spot higher. Essendon in 14th, so I actually mixed those two around. Essendon finished one spot lower than that. And St Kilda, I think, was one off 13th, which is where I had them. So let's start with Melbourne. I talked about how the wheels might come off for them. That actually isn't how I would describe season 2025. I think it was more of a continuation of the lackluster Melbourne we saw last year. They had a really bad start to 2025 from memory. Then showed some promising flashes because they still have a lot of good players, but ultimately couldn't run it out and just avoided the bottom 4. Essendon, spoke a lot about trust in this particular video, in this prediction, and while I think that's valid, it probably isn't applicable to season 2025. We know they had their injury crisis. We know that they had 6 wins in their first 10. I still don't know, how the season would have played out if they hadn't had those injuries because of that trust element. But it was a tough season from Essendon. I'll take the fact that I was only one off. And St Kilda, I've been bullish about for a while. I think that their young list is equipped to improve sometime over the next few years. If anything, I probably overrated them with how I spoke about them. But at the same time, we know at this point in October 2025, they're linked to some really quality players joining the footy club. So who knows, in 2 years they could be a very good footy side. But I suppose I was correct not quite to trust them yet. So far, not bad. Most teams I've got so far are in the right position or off by one spot, I think. So then we'll move from 9th to 12th. In 9th, I've got Carlton just missing out. In 10th, I've got the Western Bulldogs. In 11th, I've got Adelaide Crows moving up slightly, but I just don't know yet. And 12th, the Gold Coast Suns, which just seems to be where everyone shovels them into. It would be their equal best season. But where do we start? Let's start with the Carlton Footy Club. They have so much top-end talent, particularly around their spine, that it is hard to tip against them. And I would say, broadly speaking, they might even have premiership potential in terms of how good their bookends are. Like Wiedering, Curnow, Mackay. In the midfield, you got Walsh and Cripps, and then TDK has really emerged to be one of their most important players. So that's just rattling off 6 of their best players. and that is an elite spine, absolutely. Again, why is Carlton missing out on the 8? I had to pick someone, and again, I'm probably going to fall back on the trust piece with Carlton. In the year that they made the prelim, they were pretty poor for 15 rounds. And last year, they had a poor back end of the season, if I'm not mistaken. So we haven't seen Carlton put it together for an entire season. And I don't know if they can get away with that again in 2025. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to do it again. But again, I just can't trust Carlton in the same way that I can trust some of these other more consistent sides we'll talk about. The Western Bulldogs in 10th. Again, I'm iffy. Started the year poorly last year, came home with a wet sail. Lost in the elimination final against the rampaging Hawthorn, but was still one of the most prolific teams in front of goal last year with very, very strong offensive punch. Now, the narrative around them at the moment is, there's Jamari Ugle-Hagan stuff going on. I don't know how much to lead into that, but a couple of injuries as well, namely Bont and Treloar, which will take away some of their potency. Waitman is also out for a long time, if I'm not mistaken. I think Ed Richards is a chance to play round 1 as I record this. So I wonder if their depth will be tested this year. And again, when we talk about trust, we're talking about a team that has never finished in the top 4 throughout this entire Beveridge era. So I'd imagine we're going to see another inconsistent year from the Bulldogs. Their best is very good, and at times were arguably up there with anyone last year, but they just couldn't do it for long enough, and certainly not when it mattered in an elimination final. Adelaide are a tough one. I do want to put them up. I see that as a popular choice, and the case for it is strong. In 2023, they probably should have played finals, and they've recruited well this year, adding Neil Bullen, Peatling, and Isaac Cumming, in addition to Sid Draper, who I really like. Isaac Rankin is becoming an A-grader in front of our eyes, and it will be a big question what happens with Riley Thilthorpe this year. Can he take some more responsibility in terms of being the main goal kicker? There's a lot of good talent there about to pop. I still don't think we've seen the best of Rankin or Soligo, and there's a lot of upside there for the Crows. So they could prove me wrong, especially with their ability to play well at home. They could finish higher than this, but maybe I'm a little bit burned about how last year went. They did have some issues transitioning the ball from inside to outside and looked a little bit patchy. And in 12th spot, we've got the Gold Coast Suns. Again, another team with so much talent ready to pop, but maybe it's just I'm a little bit too biased against them because they haven't done it yet. They did play some pretty good footy last year. They were pretty damn good at home. I think they won 7 out of 9 last year at People's First Stadium and were not so great away from home. But with the talent that side has recruited over the last few years, it'll be just interesting to see to what extent they're ready to do it week in, week out, home or away. Guys like Rowell and Anderson and Miller, that's a very potent midfield. Bailey Humphrey is emerging. I'm keen to see more of Jed Walter. They have also recruited Rioli and Noble. So with the Hardwick factor, maybe I'm underrating the Gold Coast Suns here. But as we get into the top 8, you'll see that there's just teams I find it very hard to eliminate. Oh, this one is a bit brutal. So to recap that, Carlton in 9th, Bulldogs 10th, Adelaide in 11th, and Gold Coast in 12th. Carlton was off by 2 spots. They actually finished 11th. The Bulldogs was off by 1 spot. And Adelaide, Adelaide pulled off the biggest jump in AFL history, if I'm not mistaken, to jump from 15th last year into first position. I had them in 11th. So I actually still had them moving up by 4, but got nowhere near this prediction. And similar with Gold Coast, I predicted them to have their best season, or equal best season in their club's history. And we saw them win a final, which was outstanding progress. So, yeah, with Carlton, they never really got going this year. I know injuries were a factor. Similarly with the Bulldogs, I think I said that some of their best form in 2024 was amongst the competition's best. And I don't know if that's literally true in 2025, but some of their best form was very, very strong. We know they really pack a punch, but it cost them in the final game of the season against Fremantle, and there were some other missed opportunities along the way. Adelaide, I really just thought it was a little bit too early for, and I think I was burned a little bit, or at least had the memory in my mind fresh of a very disappointing 2024. So obviously got that wrong. And I probably have slept on Adelaide for a little while. And Gold Coast, again, from round 1 when they torched West Coast at Optus, I immediately thought, geez, these guys might actually be good. But because it was West Coast, it's hard to make the argument, because they smashed West Coast, they must be good. But I remember being really impressed, and clearly, they were a very good team this year and very close to making the top 4. In 5th place, I have Collingwood. In 6th, I have GWS. In 7th, the Sydney Swans. And 8th, I've got Port Adelaide. Port Adelaide's an interesting one. They have had a few people tip against them this year, and I suppose you'd have to say I have done that again as well by sliding them down to 8th. But I can't see them missing finals. I still think that team is too good. Is it well balanced across the field? I'm not too sure. Their midfield absolutely is their A game, and it'll be interesting to see how they cope early on with the absence of Zach Butters. But of course, we're going to see Jason Horne-Francis probably take his game to the next level, and that could be a real value add for a team that honestly finished the home and away season last year as good as anyone. Like when they beat Fremantle and Perth, I was convinced this Port Adelaide side had gone to another level. And they beat Hawthorn in Adelaide as well, which is a great win. So they made a prelim final. There is some question marks, obviously, around the Ken Hinkley situation. He'll be bowing out at the end of the year. What will that do for their mindset? I honestly don't know. But it is a bit of a strange one to be loading up for a premiership assault, knowing that you're going to have a new coach at the end of the year. They have also lost Dan Houston, which will hurt their transition a little bit. I've still got them making the 8, but I'm not sure. Sydney is an interesting one, in 7th spot. Now, again, they did not cope well after getting belted by the Cats in 2022, obviously having a pretty sloppy season the next year, but by Sydney standards, only by Sydney standards, because they still played in finals in 2023. So it wasn't like they absolutely shat the bed. This year, again, coming off a poor grand final performance, they have had a variable change. Obviously, the new coach now with Dean Cox coming in, maybe that could freshen them up a little bit. Again, it's impossible to speculate exactly how that's going to go. Their best 22 is not well balanced. It's sort of like what I said about Port Adelaide. They're very midfield heavy, and the key position stocks aren't great, particularly down back, and we saw McCartan play ball forward against Hawthorn in opening round. That being said, that was also true of them last year, and they were by far and away the best team in the competition for most of the home and away season last year, before things really turned sour. And then, of course, in the grand final, they were quite poor. So, again, to what extent can they back up? How resilient are they in 2025? I'm not going to tip them to miss the finals. It's not a very Sydney-like thing to miss the finals, but I just think they will probably slide back out of the pack, chasing the flag. Then we have the Giants in 6th, and they have one of the strongest teams that play a great brand of footy. So why haven't I got them higher? Well, again, I'm a little bit put off by their quite poor finals performances. I suppose you could say they did well to get ahead in both of those finals against Sydney and then against the Brisbane Lions, the 2 grand finalists admittedly. But it was quite uncharacteristic for a Giants side to be that meek in the finals. I thought that was quite disappointing. That being said, in terms of the strength of their team, particularly their tools, they got the Coleman medalist, and they have great defenders in Sam Taylor, Jack Buckley, and a really strong midfield as well. It's a very dynamic forward line too. Aaron Cadman is emerging, former number 1 pick, and you got Darcy Jones, Toby Green, the aforementioned Jesse Hogan as well. So there's real dynamism to that team. I really liked who they drafted. To what extent that will really impact their ladder position, I'm not sure. So there's plenty to like about GWS. Could it be one of those years where they finish 6th and make a really good run in finals? That seems like something they would be capable of, but I'm not going to back them in to finish in the top 4. And now Collingwood, I've got them bouncing back into the top 4. I think they'll be energised by having a little bit of a longer break. I don't think they coped with that well. I don't think they started the season well in 2024. Well, that's actually quite objectively true. They just didn't. And I do wonder if having missed the finals last year and having a bit of a mental reset, I think they're too good to not play finals, and I think they will be dangerous again. And I think their best form last year was very, very dangerous. They just couldn't maintain that, but they've got some fresh blood in there. Houston, Perryman, and now Tim Membry as well have joined. They've got a lot of players hanging on at the last little bit of their career. Pendlebury, Jeremy Howe, still side bottom, and there's probably more. But they're the oldest and most experienced list. Could that tip them and give them an edge come September, or will it just be tough for them to run out a season? I'm not sure, but I'm going to back them in. I think Collingwood will be a good team. Okay, to recap that, Port Adelaide I had in 8th and they finished 13th. That's not very good. Sydney I had in 7th and they finished 10th. GWS I had in 6th, they finished 5th. And Collingwood finished 4th, but I predicted them in 5th. So those last 2 are pretty good. And Sydney, I suppose, probably the injuries may have cost them a top 8 spot, because I thought some of their best footy was pretty good. Not at their very best, but they beat the Lions at the Gabba late in the season. They beat Fremantle twice. They weren't horrible when they played well this year, Sydney, but obviously the injuries, I think, really had their impact this year. And Port Adelaide, another team that had injuries, I really thought I was underselling them by putting them 8th. So it was a really disappointing year from them. Again, another team with injuries. So that was a very common thing with some of these teams that underperformed in 2025. But even still, it doesn't feel like Port Adelaide are going to rebound next year. Butters missed the first 5 or 6. He still had a good season, as did Rosie. Horne-Francis maybe didn't improve in the explosive fashion we expected, but structurally as well, with their forward line missing some players too, that made it hard. But, to fall from a prelim to 13th is an incredibly disappointing year. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who probably tipped them to finish higher than where they actually did. But at the same time, it's not a good prediction. I predicted them to play finals. I predicted them to finish higher than Adelaide. And how bad does that look now? GWS I sort of more or less got right in the same part of the ladder. Couldn't trust them for top 4. They're best and worst. There was a big gap this year. Collingwood, I will take some pride in getting that prediction right because they had fallen out of the 8 and were the oldest list in the competition. So there were people not expecting them to be a contender this year, and I undersold them by 1 spot. I'll take that because I think that's a pretty good call on Collingwood. I thought they'd be a good team without necessarily going all the way in the end. Eliminated in a preliminary final. And then we'll go with my top 4. I've got the Cats and the Lions taking out the top 2 positions, followed by Hawthorn and then the Fremantle Footy Club. Let's start with Fremantle. They're a bit of a hot one that everyone's sort of jumping on that I can see as a smoky to finish top 4, and that is something I think I said at the end of the draft or something like that. I think I did an early ladder prediction. I also claimed Fremantle would move up. I think their team is starting to mature rather than being one of the youngest and least experienced teams. I think they're about middle of the pack for age now. Their best 22 is very well balanced with talls at either end of the ground, particularly Tracy and Amos. I think that packs a lot of potential, supported by Luke Jackson. And the midfield has also been bolstered by the emergence of Hayden Young. We know Brayshaw and Sarong are great. They've also added Shea Bolton. And with a team that probably should have played finals last year, save for a poor final month, I think there was some injuries around that. I think Fremantle playing finals is a pretty safe bet, and I'll back them as my team to bounce into the top 4 for the first time. In third, I've got Hawthorn. I've been a little reluctant to jump on the bandwagon that they're simply going to win the premiership. I feel like that narrative's been a little bit out there. That being said, taking the full preseason to digest it, I think their team is far too strong to bet against, and I think Sam Mitchell is far too good a coach to bet against in 2025. So we've seen them one game into the season. Like, I've got a bit of an advantage there with this ladder prediction. I've seen them front up in opening round and play pretty well. Their midfield gave Sydney an absolute bath. They've also added some really important pieces down back with Battle and Barras. So with their dynamic small forward line, yes, there's a question mark over a key forward. I think Hawthorn will be too good to miss out. And again, looking at age and list demographics, etc., they're still kind of middle of the pack. They're not actually as young as they were previously, with some good recruits as well. So Hawthorn will finish third. And then with the top 2, again, Brisbane is self-explanatory. It's kind of a little bit academic predicting them to finish in a particular spot. I think they'll go deep once again. They've got a very mature list. They've added Levi Ashcroft. They have lost Joe Danaher. That will be a question mark, as well as how they start the season. Not because, obviously they started the season poorly last year and it didn't really affect them come September. It really just mattered how good they were in September. But in terms of placing the ladder position, I'm not too sure whether or not we'll see a slow start from the Brisbane Lions. It may work in their favour that their first game against Geelong has been pushed back. We'll see what happens there. But for me, a really safe bet to at least be in the mix come September. I'll think that they will probably be in the top 2 by the end of the home and away season. Geelong, I'm going to back in to take the minor premiership out. Again, if you think back to the prelim final weekend, Geelong were the flag favourite. Now, it was an amazing prelim where the Brisbane Lions emerged to win by 10 points from memory. But the Cats are a very good team. They really clicked into gear at the back end of that season. They keep belying what people are saying about their age, including me. I kept thinking they're about to fall off a cliff, but they keep coming back. I think there's some concern over an injury to Cam Guthrie. I think he's listed as a TBC, so I'm not sure how long that is. But Bailey Smith coming into this team, I just feel very confident that that is the club where Bailey Smith is going to play to his true potential. And if that's the case, we've got a seriously good player that adds to a very strong team already. So I am going to back in the Cats to take out the minor premiership. Okay, so Fremantle in 4th. They ended up finishing 6th. Hawthorn in 3rd. They finished 8th but made a prelim. The Brisbane Lions finished 3rd, but I had them in 2nd. And Geelong I had top of the ladder. So to go through those one by one, Fremantle perhaps was a little bit early on them. It's hard to tell with them. I feel like they're a team that, with their best footy, when they clicked into their best form this year, I thought it felt like so much of it was on heart and, of course, talent. But they didn't really, systematically break down teams this year. And I wonder if that was the difference between 4th and 6th. As we know, it was a very even competition in that top 9. So, another result goes their way and they are in the top 4. They weren't that far off it. But overall, a good year, albeit it ended in disappointing fashion. They would have loved to have won a final. Hawthorn in 3rd. again, like there wasn't that much of a huge gap in the home and away season between the top 4 and 8th position, and we know that is evidenced by the fact that Hawthorn managed to make a prelim. They knocked out first and they knocked out 5th as well, which is pretty crazy actually. It's a great final series from Hawthorn and probably more reflective where they're at as a footy club. 8th didn't really reflect it. Were they the 3rd best team in the competition? Well, they made it to the final 4. So they're not too far off it, to be honest. You got the top 2 teams right, or at least the best 2 teams in the competition correct. Not really a huge call, really. I mean, they played an amazing prelim the year before. I did say it's academic where Brisbane finish, and it really, we know we can trust them in September. They had a blip in week 1 against the Cats, and then turned it on in grand final day. Geelong, I think I will take some credit for having a great call on Bailey Smith. He had an outstanding season. And I think there were some doubters going into 2025. So I am glad that I called that one. So let's go through the awards quickly before we wrap up. I'm going to say that Jeremy Cameron takes out the Coleman Medal Award. I cannot remember if he's won one. He might have won it in 2020 for the Giants or 2019 when they made the grand final. But I think if he has a fully fit season, Geelong will finish first and he will win the Coleman. Rising Star seems like a bit of a cop-out, and Jagger Smith has obviously done an ACL. He would have been probably one of the main contenders. Levi Ashcroft is another vanilla safe bet, so I'll probably lock that in. But keep an eye on guys like Sid Draper and Jared Berry, 2 guys I think are a serious chance as well. Maybe even Murphy Reid if he can get a game at Fremantle. We'll see what happens there. The Brownlow, Nick Dacos. Too obvious, I'm going to back him in anyway. He'll win his first Brownlow medal if he can stay fit. But to throw out another substitute for that, I'll say Nick Dacos is my prediction, but Caleb Sarong is a player that I think if Fremantle have a good season, clearance players like Sarong tend to poll well in the voting. So I think he is a really good shout. And then for your grand final, this is pretty lame. I'm going to pick first to beat second in my ladder. And I will say that Geelong beat the Brisbane Lions in a great grand final, similar to maybe the prelim that we saw at the end of 2024. That was a great game. Hopefully they can replicate that. But I think the Cats will win the premiership in 2025. Oh, a nice finish to this video. Gee whiz. That middle part of the ladder prediction wasn't great, but I really come home strong with a wet sail. I had the Coleman medalist as Jeremy Cameron. Again, not a massive long shot, but it's still nice to have picked the right one. The Rising Star, I picked Ashcroft, which, is a safe bet, a bit vanilla. I'm glad that I at least mentioned Murphy Reid. I didn't remember doing that. I did mention Joe Berry and Sid Draper, and, they didn't really get close to it. And I don't think played too many games, if I'm not mistaken. Certainly not Draper, at least from my memory. The Brownlow, I went Dacos, but I chucked in Sarong as a smoky, and then, funnily enough, I'd forgotten I did that. And then on the Brownlow nights, I actually put $25 on Caleb Sarong. So I got the logic right, the clearance style player, but I got the player wrong. That was Matthew Rao. But I'll say I tipped Dacos and got that wrong. He was the favourite though. And how good is this? I picked the right grand final. I picked the wrong winner. I tipped the Cats to beat the Lions on grand final day. But all the way back in March, I said Cats Lions grand final. I'll take that, to be honest. So those are my predictions. I'll summarise some of the best and worst calls. I'd say the worst calls, I'll probably put West Coast to finish higher than Richmond was a pretty bad call. I mean, there's a 4-win gap, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was 1 win and 5 wins. I'll cop that as a bad call. Again, probably more underselling Richmond. I don't remember being super optimistic about West Coast this year, but at the same time also didn't really think they'd be this bad. But, in the end, it wasn't a good call. I'd also had some bad calls on Port Adelaide, the Crows, the Swans, and the Suns. To some extent, the Swans one, I do feel like had they had a full injury list, they would have played finals, to be honest. Or an empty injury list. A reasonable injury list is what I mean. But for the good calls, I thought the bottom 6 I got was pretty much close. Again, it was probably fairly easy to pick, but I did a pretty good job there. Correct grand final, correct Coleman medalist. I like that I at least named Murphy Reid because he was pick 18 or pick 17 last year. I'm pleased with my Pies call. They finished 1 spot off. I tipped them to come back into finals. The Blues and Dogs to miss finals was also a pretty good call. And I like that I named Bailey Smith as well. But overall, it was a bit of a mixed bag predictions. I'll brag about calling the grand final in March. That was pretty cool. I also, for those who didn't see, prior to the grand final, so a week ago, I tipped Ashcroft for the North Myth. I tipped Dempsey to kick the first goal of the game. And I tipped Brisbane to win by 5 goals. Again, I'm just seeing it here, baby. Although we'll ignore the fact that in March I said Geelong would beat them. Anyway, guys, let me know in the comments what you thought of those ladder predictions. Let me know, like, what were some of your best calls and your worst calls. Please be honest, I will not be able to fact check you, but it's really interesting, like, looking at these videos, immortalizing them on the internet, and being able to go back and think, gee, wow, that was a great call, or geez, I didn't know what I was talking about. Let me know in the comments what you think, guys. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.